Welcome to this deep dive. We're taking a close look today at some pretty concerning job numbers that came out recently.
Yeah, specifically focusing on the impact on Black women in April 2025.
Exactly. And we're digging into this using source material you shared, mainly a YouTube transcript analyzing Bureau of Labor Statistics data and other sources.
Right, it connects the dots between the latest figures, historical context, and even proposes some, well, potential ways forward.
So our mission here is really to get beyond just the headlines for you. We want to help you understand the details, pull out the key factors the source material discusses, and think about the implications and those proposed solutions.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's jump right in with the big number. The one that really stands out from the source is this. Over 100,000 Black women lost jobs in April, just last month.
Yeah, that's a staggering figure. And the source pulls that directly from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
It's specific, right? An increase of 106,000 unemployed Black women counted in April.
And their unemployment rate, it jumped significantly from 5.1% in March up to 6.1% in April.
A full percentage point jump in a single month.
Exactly. And the source also points to data from HBCU Money, I believe.
That's right.
Saying the number of Black women employed is now at a 5-month low, and the number unemployed is at a 5-month high.
Yeah.
It really reinforces that BLS data.
It paints a pretty stark picture, especially as the source highlights when you contrast it with other groups in that same month, April.
White women's unemployment rate held steady, 3.3%.
Okay.
Hispanic women, their rate stayed at 4.6%.
It's also steady.
And interestingly, unemployment among Black men actually dropped a bit. It went down from 6.1% to 5.6%.
So this really zeroes in on Black women specifically experiencing this sharp downturn in April.
It does, and this is crucial, something the source really emphasizes. The overall national unemployment rate didn't change. It stayed at 4.2%.
Right. So if you only looked at that top line number, you'd think, oh, stable job market.
Exactly. It completely masks what's happening within specific demographic groups. You really need to disaggregate the data, as they say.
It shows why looking at these specific groups is so important.
Definitely. And while the April numbers for Black women are the most dramatic, the source does note a broader trend. The overall Black unemployment rate, including men, rose to 6.3%.
And that was the third month in a row it increased.
That's what the source material indicates, yes. A worrying trend building there, too.
So the obvious question the material tackles is, why? Why is this happening now, and why this specific disproportionate impact on Black women?
Well, the source connects it to a few different potential factors. It's likely not just one single thing.
Okay, what's the first one they raise?
One major connection explored is federal workforce cuts.
Ah, okay. How does that link play out?
The source provides some history here. It explains that federal jobs, historically, were really significant pathways for Black Americans to find stable employment, build some wealth, especially before the Civil Rights Act opened up more state and local government jobs.
Right, I see. So a traditional source of stable employment?
Exactly. And the source cites specific numbers. Federal employment dropped by 9,000 jobs in April.
Okay.
And that's on top of previous cuts, totaling 26,000 federal jobs lost since January.
Wow. And the link to Black women specifically?
The argument presented in the source is that Black women have historically held a larger share of these federal government positions compared to some other groups. So when those jobs are cut,
they're hit harder. It makes sense. Okay, what else does the source point to?
Another significant factor discussed is the apparent decline in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, DEI.
Okay, DEI, how is that connected?
Well, the source cites economists and labor experts, names like William Michael Cunningham and Andre M. Perry, and they apparently draw a direct line between this rise in unemployment for Black women and policies perceived as anti-DEI, along with those federal cuts. They link it specifically to what the source calls the new administration. We're just reporting what the source claims here.
Understood. So the experts cited see a direct causal link there. And how would that work practically?
The material suggests that DEI programs, both in government agencies and in private companies, have reportedly been scaled back or even eliminated.
Due to policy changes or maybe political pressure, legal challenges?
Yeah, all of the above, according to the source. And the result is that roles directly tied to DEI work, well, they just disappear.
Okay.
And there's another angle mentioned here, kind of related. The source talks about this idea, sounds controversial, that Black women might be seen as having 2 points in hiring, or admissions being a woman being Black.
Right.
And it connects this to that old unfortunate saying, Last hired, first fired.
Ah, the idea being that if they were hired partly to fulfill diversity metrics,
Yeah.
they might be more vulnerable when cuts happen or when the focus on DEI lessens. That's the perspective presented in the source.
Okay, that's quite a point. What other sectors are mentioned?
The source also points a finger at slowdowns in retail and hospitality. Makes sense. Those sectors are often early indicators of economic shifts.
Exactly. And they employ a large number of black women. The logic outlined is pretty simple. Economy slows, inflation bites, people cut back on.
Shopping, eating out, discretionary spending.
Right. And in those industries, management might respond by cutting hours, sending staff home early when business is slow. That directly impacts earnings and job stability.
And I guess that last hired, first fired idea could apply within those sectors too during downturns.
The source certainly suggests that, applying it broadly to black workers, but highlighting black women,
Yep.
especially during these economic contractions.
So federal cuts, DEI shifts, sector-specific downturns, anything else?
Yes, a really crucial one the source spent some time on. The role of networking and connections.
Ah, the who you know factor.
Precisely. The source argues it's huge,
Yeah.
especially in corporate America. Knowing someone inside can potentially help you bypass the huge applicant pools.
Which can be massive. Right, the source mentioned number.
Yeah, like 50 to maybe 500 applicants per job.
Mm-hmm.
And it can help get around those applicant tracking systems, the ATS software that screens resumes.
Right, the keyword filters. So networking isn't just nice, it's almost a necessity sometimes.
That's the argument. While tailoring your resume is still important, networking is positioned as a way, sort of, around some of those hurdles.
And how does this relate specifically to black women's unemployment?
Well, the source talks about established networks. It uses terms like good old boy clubs, but also mentions equivalent networks for women, often originating from.
Certain universities? Maybe family connections?
Exactly. It contrasts elite institutions, mentioning Harvard and Yale as examples, with others, and also talks about family ties, specific organizations. The perspective offered is that black women are often, quote, shut out from the spaces where these really crucial connections get made.
Which makes the job hunt that much harder if those networks are how many good jobs are actually filled.
It compounds the difficulty.
And underlying all of this, does the source talk about broader systemic issues?
It does. It includes the viewpoint of Dr. Julianne Melvo,
Okay.
and she's quoted attributing these disparities pretty directly to racism and an opportunity gap.
So calling it out explicitly.
Yes. She apparently points to things like unconscious bias, especially in service and hospitality. And the source itself explicitly connects racism to that last hired, first fired phenomenon we've mentioned.
It really paints a complex picture with multiple overlapping factors.
Definitely. It's not presented as one simple cause.
It's interesting how the source then takes this current situation and puts it into historical context. You mentioned the Great Depression earlier.
Yeah, it draws a direct parallel.
Mm.
During the Depression years, 1929 to 1939, the source states African Americans faced the highest unemployment rates by far.
They were the first to lose jobs.
First to see hours cut, first to lose jobs, yes.
Yeah.
The data cited is pretty shocking. Black unemployment hit around 50% in 1932.
50%. That's hard to even imagine.
And that was double, sometimes triple, the rate for white Americans at the time.
Right.
And because they were often concentrated in lower paying, less secure jobs back then.
They had less of a safety net, less cushion when the economy just collapsed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Made recovery much, much harder.
The source also mentions some political shifts connected to that era.
It did. It notes that the Depression spurred a lot of activism in the black community and was a factor in the shift of political allegiance towards the Democratic Party.
But it also pointed out some New Deal policies weren't helpful.
Right. It specifically mentions things like redlining, which actively harmed black communities, even as other parts of the New Deal were intended to help. It's a complex legacy.
And the source sees echoes of those dynamics today.
It suggests so, yeah. Observing that even now, many low-wage, entry-level jobs tend to be filled by people perhaps more willing or needing to accept lower pay and fewer benefits, potentially reflecting some of those long-standing economic structures.
Beyond the official unemployment numbers, did the source touch on things like people leaving the workforce, that whole Great Resignation idea?
It did, but mainly to clarify something important.
Okay.
People who voluntarily leave the labor force, maybe they retired early, decided to stay home, whatever, if they're not actively looking for work, they aren't counted in those unemployment statistics we've been discussing.
Ah, right. Unemployment figures only count those looking for work but unable to find it.
Exactly. So the rising rate for Black women isn't about them quitting. It's about more of them actively seeking jobs and not finding them.
That's a crucial distinction. And did it say anything about how long it takes to find a job again?
Yeah, it reinforces a point often observed.
Hmm.
It typically takes longer for Black workers, and the source highlights Black women again here, to find new employment after a job loss compared to other groups.
So the job search itself is often harder or longer.
hmm And it also touches on that whole narrative of labor shortages you hear about sometimes.
Right, that there are jobs but no workers.
The source offers a perspective that maybe these shortages aren't universal, or that the available jobs might disproportionately favor those who already have advantages, like those strong networks we talked about.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a simple case of jobs being readily available for everyone who's looking.
That seems to be the implication drawn in the material, yes.
So given this pretty bleak picture, the numbers, the historical context, the interconnected factors, but what does the source material suggest in terms of solutions? Where do we go from here?
Well, the perspective that comes through really strongly is that this situation should be seen as a kind of wake-up call
Well, wake-up call about what specifically?
about the vulnerability that comes from a lack of ownership,
Uh-huh.
both, personal ownership and community ownership.
Okay, ownership, that sounds key. Did it elaborate on that?
Yes. There's actually a critique in the source about focusing too much on individual success stories, Black excellence, without ensuring that success contributes to lifting the broader community economically.
Sort of the pulling up the ladder behind you idea.
Exactly, that phrase is used. The idea that individual success isn't enough if the community base isn't strengthened.
So how does ownership fix that, according to the source?
The primary solution proposed is centered squarely on ownership.
Okay.
It specifically talks about worker cooperatives.
Worker co-ops, where the employees actually own part of the business.
Yes, exactly that model, where workers have a stake, an ownership piece. It's presented as a way to potentially buffer against layoffs because the workers are the owners, or at least part owners.
Contrasting with the typical model where most people are just employees working for a company someone else owns.
Right. The source argues that while community support systems are important, the community itself needs an economic foundation, and ownership is presented as the way to build that.
Does it mention other forms of ownership?
It definitely promotes Black-owned businesses more generally. The idea seems to be building alternatives within the community, rather than solely relying on large corporations for jobs. It even mentions Target as an example of a large corporation people might rely on.
So building an internal economy, in a way.
That seems to be the core idea,
Yeah.
and it connects this to education. There's a strong call for educational reform. The argument is that teaching kids about ownership, about how to start things like worker co-ops, shouldn't wait for college.
It needs to start earlier,
Yeah.
K-12.
Yes, to fundamentally shift the mindset from just aiming to be an employee, a worker bee, as the source puts it, to thinking like an owner, a builder, an entrepreneur.
Because not everyone goes to college, so that foundation needs to be laid earlier for everyone.
Precisely. It's framed as essential for building long-term economic power and resilience within the community.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered a lot from that source material. We started with those specific, really quite alarming job loss numbers for Black women in April.
That sharp jump in unemployment.
Then we explored the complex mix of factors the source connects to this, the federal job cuts, the shifts around DEI initiatives, downturns in key sectors like retail.
The critical role of networks and connections, and how lack of access can be a barrier.
And importantly, grounding it all in that historical context, the parallels drawn to the Great Depression and the ongoing impact of systemic issues like racism and the opportunity gap mentioned by Dr. Malveaux.
Right, leading up to those proposed solutions focused heavily on ownership worker co-ops, supporting Black-owned businesses.
And that call for teaching ownership principles much earlier in the education system.
It definitely shows how one number, that national unemployment rate, can really hide what's happening underneath.
Absolutely. And it leaves us, and you, with something to think about. Given these recurring patterns we've discussed today, themes echoing from the Great Depression right up to now.
And that very strong focus in the source material on ownership and community networks as potential keys to economic stability.
How might understanding these dynamics, the historical context, the networking factor, the potential power of ownership, how might that change your perspective on building economic security, both personally and collectively moving forward?